The wooden doors of Poissy Convent splintered under the battering ram at 2 a.m. on March 14, 1418. Sister Marie-Catherine heard the crack of wood before she saw the torches. She was 13 years old and had been at the convent for 8 months, sent there by her noble family to preserve their inheritance for her older brothers. The Burgundian soldiers poured through the shattered entrance like water through a broken dam. There were 47 of them, fresh from a skirmish outside Paris, drunk on looted wine and victory. The convent housed 127 women. 73 of them were under the age of 16. Mother Superior Agnès ran toward the chapel, screaming for the sisters to hide. The soldiers caught her in the courtyard. They grabbed her by her grey hair and dragged her back toward the dormitories. She was 62 years old and had served God for 44 years. Her screams woke the entire convent. The younger nuns tried to barricade themselves in the sleeping quarters. They pushed wooden beds against the doors. It bought them maybe 3 minutes. When the soldiers kicked through, Sister Marie-Catherine watched from under a bed as they pulled her friend Isabel out by her ankle. Isabel was 14. She had taken her vows just 6 weeks earlier. The thing nobody talks about in history books is how young these women were. Poissy Convent was a dumping ground for noble families who had too many daughters and not enough dowries to go around. The average age was 17. Some girls had been there since they were 9 years old, before they even understood what religious vows meant. Sister Anne-Marie, who was 15, tried to run to the cellar. A soldier caught her on the stairs. He smashed her head against the stone wall 3 times. Her skull cracked with a sound like an egg breaking. She was still breathing when he dragged her down the hallway, leaving a trail of blood and brain matter on the floor. The soldiers worked methodically. They went room to room, dragging the nuns out from under beds, from behind doors, from inside wooden chests where some had tried to hide. One novice, barely 12 years old, had crawled into the bread oven in the kitchen. They found her when they heard her crying. She couldn't stop screaming even after they pulled her out. Mother Superior Agnès tried to negotiate. She offered them the convent's silver chalices, the gold crosses from the altar, anything of value they could carry. The commander, a man named Jacques de Bourbon, laughed in her face. He told her they already planned to take everything. Then he backhanded her so hard she lost 3 teeth. The violence wasn't random. It was calculated. The soldiers separated the nuns into groups. The youngest and prettiest were dragged to the dormitory. The older ones were locked in the refectory. Sister Marie-Catherine saw them force Mother Superior Agnès into a chair and tie her hands behind her back. They positioned the chair facing the dormitory entrance. They wanted her to hear everything. By 3 a.m., the screaming had become constant. Not individual voices anymore, just one continuous sound of terror that echoed through the stone corridors. Some of the local villagers heard it from half a mile away. None of them came to help. Everyone knew better than to interfere with Burgundian soldiers during wartime. What the soldiers did to those women wasn't warfare. It wasn't even about conquest or territory. It was pure cruelty for the sake of cruelty, and every single one of them knew it. But what those soldiers did to the nuns in the dormitory was just the beginning of the longest night of their lives. The dormitory of Poissy Convent had 40 beds arranged in 2 rows. By 3:30 a.m., every bed held at least one nun being raped. Some beds held 2 or 3 soldiers at once, taking turns. Sister Marie-Catherine was pulled from under the bed where she'd been hiding and thrown onto a straw mattress that already had blood on it. The soldier who raped her was maybe 25 years old. He smelled like wine and smoke. He didn't say anything to her. He just held her throat with one hand while he used the other to tear her habit. When he finished, another soldier immediately took his place. Then another. Marie-Catherine stopped counting after the 5th one. Sister Marguerite, who was 16, fought back. She clawed at a soldier's face and drew blood. He responded by breaking her jaw with his fist. The bone shattered so badly that pieces came through her cheek. She choked on her own blood and teeth, while 2 other soldiers held her down and continued. The older nuns who had been locked in the refectory heard everything. Sister Jeanne, who was 47 and had been at Poissy for 29 years, tried to break down the door. 3 other older nuns joined her, throwing their bodies against the wood. They managed to crack it. The soldiers heard the noise and came to investigate. What they did to the older nuns was somehow worse because it was so unnecessary. These women were grandmothers, wrinkled and gray. The soldiers raped them anyway, but with more violence, more cruelty. Sister Jean had her arm broken in 3 places when she tried to protect a younger nun. Sister Catherine, who was 59, had several ribs cracked when a soldier kicked her in the chest for crying too loudly. Mother Superior Agnes remained tied to the chair in the hallway, forced to listen. Soldiers would occasionally walk past her and describe what they were doing in the other rooms. One soldier, barely 18 years old himself, vomited after raping a 12-year-old novice. His commanding officer beat him for showing weakness. The convent's physician, Sister Elizabeth, tried to help the wounded. She was trained in basic medicine and had treated minor injuries for years. When she attempted to reach the dormitory with bandages and herbs, a soldier grabbed her. She was 52 years old and had been celibate her entire adult life. They raped her in the corridor where everyone could see. Some of the youngest nuns were virgins. The physical trauma was catastrophic. Sister Anne Sophie, who was 13, bled so heavily that she lost consciousness. She died sometime around 5 a.m., though nobody noticed immediately because there was too much chaos. Her body was discovered later, still on the bed where she'd been assaulted, cold and empty. The soldiers competed with each other. They made jokes about which nun screamed the loudest. They wagered on who could rape the most women before dawn. One soldier named Pierre kept a tally on the wall with charcoal. He marked 17 lines before he finally passed out from exhaustion and alcohol. By dawn, the dormitory looked like a slaughterhouse. Blood soaked the mattresses. Torn habits and undergarments littered the floor. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of sweat, semen, blood, vomit, and human waste. Many of the nuns had lost control of their bowels during the assaults. Nobody had been allowed to leave to use the latrine. Sister Marie-Catherine lay on her mattress, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't feel her legs. Her insides felt torn apart. She could hear other nuns crying, but the sounds seemed distant, like they were coming from underwater. She thought about her mother, who had sent her to the convent with promises that she would be safe here, protected by God and the church. When the sun finally rose through the narrow windows, the soldiers began to sober up. They looked around at what they had done. Some seemed disturbed. Most just looked tired. The commander, Jacques de Bourbon, surveyed the scene with the detachment of a man inspecting livestock. That's when he realized they had a problem. There were survivors. There were witnesses. And even in the chaos of the 100 Years' War, raping and murdering over 100 nuns would bring consequences if word got out. He gathered his men in the courtyard and spoke quietly. Sister Marie-Catherine, barely conscious, heard fragments of the conversation through the broken door. Words like evidence and clean up and no witnesses. But when the morning light fully illuminated the horror inside that convent, the soldiers understood they needed to do more than just leave. They needed to erase what happened entirely. Jacques de Bourbon made his decision by 7 a.m. The surviving nuns would be locked in the chapel and burned alive. It was cleaner than executing them one by one, and fire would destroy evidence. He ordered his men to round up anyone still breathing. Sister Marie-Catherine could barely walk. 2 soldiers dragged her across the courtyard, her feet scraping against the cobblestones. She saw other nuns being pulled from the dormitory, from the refectory, from the cellar where some had managed to hide during the night. Mother Superior Agnès was untied from her chair and pushed along with the others. The chapel of Poissy Convent was small, built to hold maybe 50 people for Mass. The soldiers forced 89 surviving nuns inside. Some were unconscious and had to be carried. Others were bleeding so heavily they left trails across the stone floor. The chapel had stained glass windows on 3 sides and heavy wooden doors at the entrance. Sister Jeanne, despite her broken arm, tried to reason with the commander. She offered him money, promised silence, begged for mercy. He listened to her entire plea without expression. Then he pushed her back inside the chapel and slammed the doors. The sound of the wooden bar dropping into place echoed through the space. The nuns heard footsteps outside, then voices, then the smell of smoke. The soldiers had piled straw and broken furniture against the chapel walls. They soaked everything in oil from the convent's kitchen stores. When Jacques de Bourbon threw the first torch, the flames caught immediately. The dry wood of the chapel's exterior walls began to burn within seconds. Sister Marie-Catherine pressed herself against one of the stained glass windows. She could see soldiers outside, standing in a circle, watching. Some were eating bread they'd stolen from the kitchen. Others were passing a wine bottle back and forth. They looked bored, like men waiting for a job to finish so they could go home. The heat built slowly at first. The nuns closest to the walls felt it before the others. Sister Anne-Thérèse, who was 15, started screaming when the wall behind her grew too hot to touch. She ran to the center of the chapel, where other nuns were already crowding together, trying to get away from the spreading heat. Mother Superior Agnès organized them as best she could. She led them in prayer, her voice steady despite the bruises on her face and the blood crusted around her mouth from her missing teeth. Some of the younger nuns joined in. Others just cried. A few sat in silence, staring at nothing, already broken beyond repair. The stained glass windows shattered from the heat around 7:45 a.m. The sound was like gunshots. Colored glass exploded inward, cutting several nuns who were standing too close. Sister Marie-Catherine felt something slice across her arm. When she looked down, she saw her own blood mixing with fragments of blue and red glass that had depicted the Virgin Mary. Fresh air rushed in through the broken windows, feeding the fire outside. The flames grew higher, hotter. The wooden ceiling beams began to smoke. Sister Marguerite, whose jaw had been shattered hours earlier, tried to climb through one of the window frames. Her broken jaw made it impossible to scream properly when her habit caught fire. The sound she made was worse than screaming. She fell back into the chapel, flames spreading across her body. Two nuns tried to smother the fire with their own habits. It didn't work. Sister Marguerite burned for almost 3 minutes before she stopped moving. The smell of burning flesh filled the chapel. Several nuns vomited. The vomit just added another layer to the stench. The ceiling beams caught fire around 8 a.m. Burning wood began to rain down into the chapel. A piece of flaming timber fell on Sister Catherine, the 59-year-old who already had broken ribs. It pinned her to the floor. She screamed for help, but there was nowhere to move. The chapel was packed with bodies pressed together, everyone trying to stay away from the walls, away from the windows, away from the burning ceiling. Sister Elizabeth, the physician, tried to treat burns with her bare hands. She had nothing else. No water, no bandages, no herbs. She pressed her palms against blistered skin, knowing it was useless but needing to do something. Her own hands began to blister from the heat in the air. Some nuns died from smoke inhalation before the flames reached them. They simply collapsed, their lungs too damaged to function. Sister Marie-Catherine saw a young novice, maybe 11 years old, fall to her knees mid-prayer. The girl's lips were still moving when she hit the floor, but no sound came out. She didn't get up again. The walls began to collapse inward around 8:30 a.m. Burning stones fell into the crowd of nuns. One wall section crushed 3 women instantly. Another fell across Sister Jeanne's legs, trapping her. She screamed for someone to move it. Nobody could. The stone was too heavy, and there was no room to maneuver in the packed chapel. Mother Superior Agnes remained standing until the end. She held the hands of 2 young novices, girls who had been at the convent less than a year. When the main ceiling beam finally gave way, it fell directly on the 3 of them. They disappeared under burning wood and stone. The sound of the collapse drowned out their final screams. Sister Marie-Catherine felt the heat cooking her from the inside. Her lungs burned with each breath. Her skin felt like it was shrinking, pulling tight across her bones. She looked at the broken window one last time. Through the smoke and flames, she could still see soldiers outside. One of them was laughing at something his companion had said. The chapel of Poissy Convent burned for 4 hours. By the time the flames died down, nothing remained but blackened stone walls and ash. The stained glass was melted. The wooden pews were gone. and somewhere in the smoking ruins lay the remains of 89 women who had been promised divine protection. But the real horror wasn't discovered until the villagers finally gathered enough courage to approach the smoldering wreckage the next morning. The smell reached the village of Poissy before dawn on March 16th. It was a thick, sweet odor that clung to everything, the unmistakable stench of burned human flesh mixed with smoke and melted fat. Pierre Lenoir, a local blacksmith, was the first to approach the convent ruins. He vomited before he even reached the chapel. The stone walls still stood, blackened and cracked from the heat. The roof was completely gone. Inside, the floor was covered in a layer of ash and debris about 3 feet deep. And buried in that ash were the bodies. They weren't bodies anymore, not really. The heat had been so intense that many of the corpses had fused together. Pierre saw what looked like a mass of blackened flesh in the center of the chapel, a tangle of charred limbs and skulls that had melted into each other. He couldn't tell where one body ended and another began. The village priest, Father Michel, arrived with several other men. He had served Poissy for 16 years and knew many of the nuns personally. He had baptized some of them, heard their confessions. Now he stood at the edge of the ruins and tried to pray, but no words came. They found Mother Superior Agnès near what had been the altar. Her body was pinned under a massive ceiling beam, burned beyond recognition. They only identified her by the silver cross she wore, which had partially melted into her chest. The cross had been a gift from her mother when she took her vows 44 years earlier. Sister Jeanne's body was trapped under the collapsed wall, just as Marie Catherine had last seen her. The stone had crushed her pelvis and legs, but the position of her arms showed she'd been trying to pull herself free when she died. Her fingernails had scraped grooves in the stone floor. Near the shattered windows, they found several bodies that had been trying to escape when they died. Their hands were still raised toward the window frames, fingers burned down to bone. One skull showed signs of having been pressed against the hot stone wall. The back of the skull had a depression where the superheated rock had partially melted the bone. The worst discovery was in the corner, farthest from the door. There they found the body of a pregnant nun. She had been perhaps 5 months along, her belly swollen even through the burned tissue. The extreme heat had caused her abdomen to rupture. The fetus was partially visible, tiny and perfectly formed, cooked inside its mother's womb. Nobody knew which nun she was. There were no identifying features left. But the men who saw her understood immediately what it meant. She had been raped during the attack months ago, probably during an earlier raid that nobody had reported. She had carried that shame and trauma for months, hidden it under her habit. And now she and her unborn child were just more casualties in a war that had already claimed thousands. Pierre Lenoir counted skulls. He found 87 in the chapel ruins. 2 bodies were never found. They had likely burned so completely that nothing identifiable remained, just ash mixed with all the other ash that covered the floor. The village carpenter built a massive coffin, more like a wooden box, big enough to hold all the remains. There was no way to separate them. Bones had fused together, skulls had rolled and mixed, melted fat and tissue had created a kind of gruesome mortar that held everything together. Father Michel held a funeral mass, but the Bishop of Paris sent word that it should be a simple affair. No elaborate ceremony, no special honors. When Father Michel asked why, the response was brief. The nuns had lost their purity during the attack. They could not be buried in consecrated ground as virgins and brides of Christ. The village erupted in outrage. These women had been raped and murdered. They hadn't chosen to break their vows. But the church hierarchy was clear. Canon law stated that a nun who engaged in sexual activity, regardless of consent, was no longer worthy of burial in blessed ground. Father Michel defied the order. He buried the mass grave in the convent cemetery anyway, in a plot reserved for the sisters. He performed the full funeral rites. The bishop censured him for it. Father Michel didn't care. He told the bishop's representative that if God couldn't forgive rape victims, then perhaps the church was worshipping the wrong God. The families of the dead nuns were notified. Most never claimed their daughters' remains. There was nothing to claim anyway, just a share of ash and bone in a communal grave. But more than that, acknowledging the dead meant acknowledging the shame. Several noble families actively denied that their daughters had ever been at Poissy Convent. The Comte de Valois, whose daughter Marie-Catherine had been among the victims, publicly stated that his daughter had died of fever 2 years earlier. He refused to attend any memorial. He wanted no association with the massacre or the implications of what his daughter had endured before death. The villagers erected a simple wooden cross over the mass grave. It listed no names, just a date, March 14th, 1418. Within a year, the wooden cross had rotted and fallen over. Nobody replaced it. The convent ruins were stripped for building materials. Within 5 years, there was no physical evidence that Poissy Convent had ever existed. But buried in the church archives in Paris, sealed away from public view, were documents that told a different story. Letters and reports that revealed the full scope of what happened that night, and more importantly, what the church knew before it happened. Those documents wouldn't be discovered for another 400 years. And what they revealed was somehow even more disturbing than the massacre itself. Jacques de Bourbon and his 47 soldiers left Poissy on March 15, 1418, around noon. They took the convent's silver, gold crosses and whatever food remained in the storage cellars. They also took 6 horses from the village stables. Nobody tried to stop them. 3 weeks later, the village mayor sent a formal complaint to the Burgundian military command in Paris. He detailed the massacre, the rapes, the burning of the chapel. He included testimony from witnesses who had heard the screaming. He requested that the soldiers be arrested and tried for their crimes. The response came 6 weeks later. A military tribunal reviewed the case and determined that no crime had been committed. The official judgment stated that the nuns of Poissy had refused to provide supplies to Burgundian forces during wartime. This refusal constituted treason against the Duke of Burgundy. The soldiers had acted within their authority to punish traitors. Father Michel traveled to Paris to appeal the decision. He brought letters from the Mother Superior's personal correspondence, showing that the convent had no supplies to give. They had been barely feeding themselves. The Burgundian tribunal refused to hear his appeal. They told him to go home and stop wasting their time. The church response was even worse. Bishop Henri de Montfort issued a pastoral letter addressing the Poissy massacre. The letter was read from pulpits across the region. It stated that the nuns had failed in their duty to remain pure and chaste. By allowing themselves to be violated, they had broken their sacred vows to Christ. The letter went further. It suggested that the nuns must have provoked the attack through immodest behavior or failure to maintain proper spiritual discipline. God had allowed their suffering as punishment for their sins. The massacre was divine judgment, not a crime requiring earthly justice. Father Michel kept a copy of that letter. Years later, historians would find it in his personal papers, covered in angry margin notes. Next to the passage about divine judgment, he had written, "What God punishes children with rape, what God burns his own brides alive." The families of the dead nuns received the bishop's letter. Most accepted it without question. The alternative was worse. Admitting that their daughters were innocent victims meant admitting they had sent those daughters to a place that couldn't protect them. It meant acknowledging that the church had failed, that vows meant nothing, that prayer was useless against men with weapons and bad intentions. The Comte de Valois publicly supported the bishop's position. He donated money to build a new chapel in Paris, dedicated to purity and chastity. He never mentioned his daughter Marie-Catherine. When asked about Poissy, he changed the subject. The Comtesse de Montpellier, whose daughter Sister Jeanne had died with a broken arm trying to protect others, withdrew from public life entirely. She spent her remaining years in seclusion, refusing to speak to anyone. Her servants reported hearing her cry at night. She died 3 years after the massacre. Her will left everything to distant cousins, making no mention of her daughter. Jacques de Bourbon received a promotion. By 1420, he was commanding a garrison outside Lyon. Military records show he participated in at least 6 other church raids during the 100 Years' War. There's no evidence he ever faced consequences for any of them. Of the 47 soldiers who participated in the Poissy massacre, 43 survived the war. Most returned to normal civilian life. Several married and had children. One became a village magistrate. Another opened a successful tavern in Reims. They grew old. They died in their beds, surrounded by family, having lived full lives. The 2 survivors from Poissy convent, the ones whose bodies were never found in the chapel, remained mysteries for centuries. Church records suggested they might have escaped during the fire, but there was no evidence they survived. No one ever came forward. No letters, no testimony. Nothing. The convent land was sold in 1422 to a wine merchant. He built a house on the property. The foundation used stones from the ruined chapel. For decades, families lived on that land, unaware they were sleeping above the mass grave of 89 murdered women. By 1450, most people in Poissy had forgotten the convent ever existed. The younger generation didn't know the story. The older generation didn't talk about it. It became one of thousands of atrocities swallowed by the chaos of the 100 Years' War, unremarkable in its brutality, forgotten in its aftermath. The church archives in Paris contained all the official documents: the complaint from the village mayor, the military tribunal's decision, the bishop's pastoral letter. All of it was filed away, labeled, stored in a basement archive that smelled of mold and old paper. Those documents sat untouched for 387 years. Then, in 1805, a young priest named Father Antoine Dubois was assigned to reorganize the Paris archives. He was thorough, methodical, and curious. When he found the Poissy file, he read every page. What he discovered made him physically ill. But it wasn't the massacre itself that disturbed him most. It was the other documents in the file. Letters that had been sealed, marked confidential, hidden behind the official records. Letters that showed the church knew the attack was coming and chose to do nothing. Those letters revealed a truth that was somehow worse than the massacre itself. Father Antoine Dubois found the first sealed letter on November 3, 1805. It was addressed to Bishop Henri de Montfort, dated March 9, 1418, 5 days before the massacre. The letter was from a Burgundian military chaplain named Father Guillaume. The letter was direct. Burgundian forces planned to raid Poissy convent within the week. They needed supplies and suspected the nuns were hoarding food. Father Guillaume urged the bishop to send guards or evacuate the sisters. He wrote that the soldiers were drunk and undisciplined after weeks of combat. He feared what they might do. Bishop de Montfort's response was attached to the letter. Dated March 10, 1418, 4 days before the massacre. The response was a single paragraph. The convent of Poissy has been a financial burden on this diocese for years. The sisters produce nothing of value and consume resources better spent elsewhere. I see no reason to divert church funds for their protection. If they are attacked, it is God's will. Father Dubois had to read it 3 times before he believed what he was seeing. The bishop had received advance warning of the attack and chose to let it happen. More than that, he had welcomed it as a solution to an economic problem. The next letter was worse. Dated March 11, 1418, 3 days before the massacre. It was from the Mother Superior Agnès to the bishop, clearly written in response to some warning she had received. She begged for help. She listed every nun by name and age. She described their poverty, their innocence, their complete inability to defend themselves. She promised the convent would find a way to become financially self-sufficient if they were just given protection this one time. There was no response from the bishop in the file, just a note in his handwriting at the bottom of Mother Superior Agnès' letter. Manipulative and tiresome. Denied. Father Dubois found 16 letters total, spanning from 1415 to 1418. All of them documented the same thing: the bishop systematically cutting funding to Poissy convent. Money that was supposed to go to their food supplies, their building maintenance, their basic security. All of it diverted to other projects. One letter from 1416 showed that the bishop had taken funds meant for Poissy's wall repairs and used them to renovate his personal residence in Paris. The convent's defensive walls had gaps large enough for men to walk through. The Mother Superior had written 3 letters begging for repairs, all denied. Another document from 1417 revealed that the bishop had rejected a request to hire guards for the convent. The Mother Superior had found a retired soldier willing to work for minimal pay, just to have some protection. The bishop's response: unnecessary expense. The sisters are under God's protection. But the most damning document was dated March 17, 1418, 2 days after the massacre. It was a letter from Bishop de Montfort to the Archbishop of Paris. It described the Poissy massacre and his official response. Then it included a passage that Father Dubois would never forget. The destruction of Poissy Convent, while tragic, resolves a significant financial burden on the diocese. The annual cost of maintaining these women far exceeded any spiritual or practical benefit they provided. I anticipate saving approximately 2,400 livres per year. These funds can be redirected to more productive endeavors. In this sense, God has provided a solution to a problem that canonical law prevented me from addressing directly. The bishop had written that. 2 days after 127 women under his spiritual care had been raped, tortured, and burned alive, he was calculating the money he would save by not having to feed them anymore. Father Dubois brought the documents to his superior. He expected outrage, immediate action, perhaps an investigation into Bishop de Montfort's conduct. Instead, his superior told him to reseal the letters and never mention them again. The bishop had died in 1442. There was no point in creating a scandal about a man who had been dead for over 350 years. Father Dubois refused. He made copies of the letters. He began researching what happened to the other people involved. He tracked down military records, family genealogies, property transfers. He spent 3 years piecing together the complete story of Poissy Convent. What he discovered was a pattern. Bishop de Montfort had systematically abandoned or undermined at least 5 other convents between 1410 and 1425. 3 of them had been raided by soldiers during the 100 Years' War. 2 had simply collapsed from poverty and neglect. In every case, the bishop had diverted their funding to other projects and then blamed the nuns when tragedy struck. The financial records were detailed and meticulous. Bishop de Montfort had embezzled an estimated 47,000 livres from various convents over a 15-year period. He used the money to fund construction projects, purchase artwork, and maintain a lifestyle far beyond what his position officially allowed. He died wealthy and respected, honored by the Church as a wise administrator who managed diocesan resources efficiently. Father Dubois compiled everything into a report. He submitted it to the Archbishop in 1808, along with all the copied documents. He demanded a formal investigation and posthumous censure of Bishop de Montfort. He wanted the truth made public. The Archbishop's response came 3 months later. The report was rejected. The documents were ordered sealed again. Father Dubois was reassigned to a rural parish in Brittany, far from Paris and the archives. He was warned that any further discussion of the matter would result in excommunication. Father Dubois died in 1831. His personal papers were destroyed after his death, as was customary for priests who left no immediate family. The copies he made of the Poissy documents disappeared. The originals remained sealed in the Paris archives. They stayed sealed until 1881, when the French government nationalized many church properties and opened historical archives for academic research. A historian named Henri Beaumont found the Poissy file while researching the 100 Years' War. He published his findings in an academic journal that almost nobody read. The story gained brief attention in scholarly circles. A few articles were written. Some historians debated the authenticity of the documents. Within 2 years, it faded back into obscurity. Just another tragedy from a brutal century, remarkable only in how thoroughly it had been covered up. The mass grave at Poissy was excavated in 1924 during construction of a new road. Workers found charred bones mixed with melted metal that had once been religious medals and crosses. Forensic experts examined the remains. They confirmed that the bones belonged to at least 85 individuals, mostly female, mostly young. Many showed signs of trauma consistent with violence before death. The remains were reburied in a municipal cemetery. A small stone marker was placed, listing the date of the massacre and the approximate number of victims. No names. Nobody knew the names anymore except from old church records that few people bothered to consult. In 2003, a graduate student named Sophie Laurent wrote her doctoral thesis on the Poissy massacre. She accessed the original sealed documents, now digitized and available to researchers. She spent 4 years analyzing every letter, every financial record, every piece of evidence. Her conclusion was unambiguous. The massacre was preventable, the church was complicit, and the cover-up lasted for nearly 400 years. Her thesis was published by a university press. It sold 247 copies. Most academic libraries didn't bother to purchase it. The church issued no official response. Today, there's a small plaque in Poissy marking the approximate location of the convent. It's in a residential neighborhood, easy to miss. The plaque states that a convent once stood on this site and was destroyed during the 100 Years' War. It mentions nothing about how it was destroyed, or why, or what the church knew beforehand. The nuns of Poissy convent died believing they were under divine protection. They believed their vows mattered, that their prayers were heard, that God would not abandon his brides. They were wrong on all counts. The only hell they experienced was the one created by men who claimed to serve God while counting coins and calculating savings. Of the 127 women who lived at Poissy convent in March 1418, none survived to see April. Their families disowned them. Their church blamed them for their own suffering. Their killers lived full lives and died peaceful deaths. And for 400 years, the institution that promised to protect them hid evidence of its own betrayal in sealed archives where no one would find it. The bishop who let them die was never punished, never censured, never even questioned. He saved his 2,400 livres per year and considered it good administration. God's will, he called it. Divine providence. A solution to an economic problem. 127 women burned alive in a chapel while soldiers watched and laughed. And the man who could have saved them with a single order was already calculating how to spend the money he'd saved by letting them die. That was the real hell. Not flames and screaming. Not rape and torture. The real hell was knowing that their lives had so little value that their protector saw their deaths as a budgetary convenience. They weren't martyrs. They weren't saints. They were just a line item being eliminated from an expense report. The night the nuns were delivered to hell, they discovered that hell wasn't a place you go after death. Hell was being abandoned by everyone who promised to love you, while they counted the money they'd save by letting you burn.